Hello, dear friends. In the previous episode, after a long night where every passing minute felt endless, when the whole family was nearly in despair, believing they might lose Tony forever, a miracle finally happened. A kind man brought Tony safely to the local ward office. The door opened, and when that small figure appeared, everyone seemed to stop breathing. Hoài Ca burst into tears. Hung clenched his fists tightly, and Du stood frozen for a few seconds before finally stepping forward. That reunion was not only joy, it was the explosion of fear, guilt, regret, and anguish that had built up throughout the entire night. But right in the middle of tearful embraces and eyes that had not yet dried, Du, Tony's biological father, said something that made the atmosphere suddenly pause. After this, I think it's time for me to do something. His voice was not loud or harsh, yet it was enough for everyone to feel that things might never be the same again. And the new episode begins with that very decision. A few days after the incident, when everything on the outside seemed to have settled down, when the neighbors stopped asking questions and the house slowly returned to its normal routine, inside each person, unsettled thoughts remained. Du no longer appeared quiet and withdrawn as before. He became more reserved, spoke less, but his eyes carried something unmistakable, a carefully considered determination. That morning, Du and his older sister came to Hoài Ca and Hung's house. The door opened, but the atmosphere inside the living room was completely different from the warm Tet days before. There was no laughter, no scent of sticky rice cakes, no cheerful early spring conversations. Instead, a heaviness filled the air, as if everyone sensed that this meeting would not be simple. Tony was sitting in the corner, surrounded by his familiar toys. When he saw Du walk in, he looked up. That gaze was no longer unfamiliar, yet not entirely close either. He stared for a moment, as if thinking about something, then suddenly stood up and ran to Hoài Ca, clutching tightly onto her hand. That small action made the room even quieter. Du took a deep breath. He did not beat around the bush or try to ease into the conversation. His voice was low but firm. I want to take Tony back and raise him from now on. The words fell like a thunderclap in the already tense room. No one spoke immediately. Only a thick silence filled the space. Hoài Ca froze. She looked at Du, as if unable to believe what she had just heard. What did you just say? Du tried to remain calm. His words came out slowly but clearly. After what happened, I realized I can't let my son be in such a dangerous situation again. Hoài Ca, you now have your own family. You have Duc, you have a new life. Tony is my biological son. My family and I have the responsibility to raise him. Each sentence felt like a cut. Not because it was harsh, but because it struck the deepest place in Hoài Ca's heart. Du's sister spoke up as well, her voice not loud but firm. We don't want to make things difficult for anyone. But clearly, Tony needs a more stable environment with closer supervision. After what just happened, everyone can see that risks can occur at any time. Hoài Ca stood up abruptly. She could no longer sit still. Her voice trembled, but it was not weak. What do you mean by that? Just because of one mistake, you deny all the years I've raised him? Tony has been with me since he was little. I understand him better than anyone. I know what he's afraid of, what he likes, what he needs. You can't erase everything because of one incident. She held Tony even tighter, as if loosening her grip for even a second would mean losing him. At that moment, Hung stepped forward, standing slightly in front of Hoài Ca. He was not aggressive, but his eyes were serious. On Du, what happened that day was an accident. No one wanted it. All of us have blamed ourselves enough. I promise that from now on, something like that will never happen again. Tony is your son, no one denies that. But Hoài Ca is the one who has raised him day by day. That bond cannot simply be cut off with a few words. Du clenched his fists. Perhaps he was struggling internally too, but his decision had already been made. I don't want to argue. I don't deny Hoài Ca's efforts, but I am his biological father. I have both the right and the responsibility toward my son. If necessary, I will follow the law. That sentence drew a clear boundary. This was no longer an emotional exchange. It had become a serious matter, one that could grow longer and far more complicated. And just as he said, Du filed a lawsuit to seek custody of his son. From that moment on, everything was no longer just words exchanged in a living room. A new journey began, more tense, more heartbreaking, and one that would surely force everyone to face choices that were anything but easy. The day of the court hearing. After days of waiting with heavy hearts, that moment finally arrived. That morning, the sky was a pale gray, neither sunny nor rainy, as if the weather itself carried the quiet solemnity of those stepping into one of the biggest decisions of their lives. The courtroom doors opened, revealing a space that felt formal and cold. Rows of chairs were neatly arranged, and the bright white lights overhead only heightened the sense of seriousness and pressure. The two sides sat facing each other. The distance between the rows was not far, yet it felt as though an invisible boundary divided them. Hoài Ca tried to remain calm, but her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Each joint stood out, as if she were using all her strength to stop herself from trembling. Hung sat beside her, his gaze steady and resolute. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, saying nothing, silently offering her a firm support. Across from them, Du sat upright. His face no longer showed the frustration from the day he had come to argue at the house. Instead, he wore the composure of someone who had carefully prepared for what he was about to say. His older sister sat behind him, her eyes filled with concern but also unwavering support. When the hearing began, each statement echoed through the still courtroom. Every sound seemed amplified, making every emotion even more intense. Du presented his case. He was Tony's biological father. His voice was not loud, but it was firm. He spoke about his stable job, about his income being sufficient to provide Tony with a secure and comfortable life. He mentioned his family, relatives ready to help care for the boy, to provide a stable environment with closer supervision. Then he referred to the incident when Tony went missing as evidence that the child needed stronger protection, more careful oversight, so he would never again face such danger. His words were not accusatory, yet they tightened Hoài Ca's heart. Each mention of that incident felt like another wave of guilt washing over her. Then it was Hoài Ca's turn. She stood up, her legs slightly trembling, but her eyes did not look away. Her voice faltered in the first few sentences, as though all the emotions she had suppressed for so long were threatening to overflow. I do not deny that you are Tony's biological father, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. But since Tony was just a tiny baby, I have been the one caring for him, every meal, every night's sleep. When he had a fever, I was the one who stayed up all night. When he panicked in a crowd, I was the one who held him close. She paused, taking a deep breath. He was slow to speak. He is sensitive. I understand even the smallest changes in him. Just by looking into his eyes, I know whether he's happy or worried. To me, Tony is not just a responsibility. He is a part of my flesh and blood. I cannot imagine my life without him. Her words were not legal arguments, not numbers or clauses, but emotions built up over years. The room grew even quieter, as if everyone could feel the sincerity in every sentence. Hung stood up as well. He did not speak at length, but each word was clear. I know I am not Tony's biological father, but I love him as my own son. I am ready to take responsibility with Hoài Ca to raise, care for, and protect him. What happened that day was something no one wanted. We have learned a painful lesson, and we will do everything to ensure Tony's safety." While the adults spoke one by one, Tony sat at the back with a relative. He did not understand terms like custody rights or legal responsibility, but he could feel that something was different. The voices were no longer gentle and familiar. They were low, serious, and tense. He looked toward his mother, then toward Dew. Confusion filled his eyes. His small hand gripped the edge of his shirt, his legs swinging slightly in nervousness. When Hoài Ca stood up for her final statement, Tony suddenly burst into tears. The sound of his crying broke through the solemn silence, startling everyone. He pulled away from the person holding him and ran straight toward the front. His small steps were determined, as if there was only one place he wanted to be. He rushed to Hoài Ca and clung tightly to her leg. "Tony, it's okay." Hoài Ca immediately knelt down, no longer caring about the eyes watching her. Tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. Tony could not form words. He only sobbed, gripping his mother's clothes tightly, as if afraid that letting go would mean being separated from her forever. His tiny shoulders trembled, his face buried against her, his whole body radiating a very real fear. In that moment, every argument and every line of reasoning seemed small before the raw emotion of a child. No explanation was needed. No reminder was necessary. Everyone could clearly see one thing. In that fragile little heart, Hoài Ca was the safest place in the world. The hearing continued according to procedure, but the atmosphere had changed. Tony's crying seemed to linger in that solemn courtroom, reminding everyone that behind the adults' arguments was the delicate heart of a child, terrified of losing the one place that felt most familiar and safe. The entire courtroom fell silent. Tony's sobs still lingered in the solemn air, like an invisible thread tightening around the hearts of everyone present. No one spoke. There were no more arguments, no more legal reasoning. There was only the image of a small child clinging tightly to his mother, trembling as if terrified of being torn away from the only place that made him feel safe. Dew watched the scene, his heart feeling as though it were being crushed. He stood on the opposite side, only a few steps away, yet the distance felt immeasurable. His eyes followed Tony's every movement, the small hands gripping Hoài Ca's shirt, the tiny shoulders shaking with each sob. In that moment, every reason he had carefully prepared, every determination he had firmly held onto, suddenly felt fragile. He took a few steps forward. Each step felt unbearably heavy. He wanted to come closer, to reach out, to pull his son into his arms. But he stopped short, because he realized that Tony was not looking at him at all. He called out softly, his voice no longer carrying the firmness from earlier. "Tony, come to Dad." The call was not loud, but it echoed clearly through the room. It was no longer a declaration of paternal rights, it was a hopeful plea. But Tony shook his head. A small, firm shake. He did not look up. He only clung to Hoài Ca even tighter, as if loosening his grip for even a second would cause him to be taken away. His arms tightened, his face buried in his mother's embrace, his sobs broken and wordless. In that moment, Dew understood something he had not fully grasped before. Love is not defined by blood alone. He was Tony's biological father. That would never change. But Tony had grown up in Hoài Ca's arms. His first steps, his high fevers at night, his fear in crowded places, she had been there for all of it. For a sensitive child like Tony, Mom was not just a title. It was a refuge. The only safe haven in a vast world. Dew closed his eyes for a few seconds. In that quiet pause, he did not hear the whispers around him. He only heard the heavy pounding of his own heart. All the thoughts about responsibility, duty, and rights seemed to dissolve before the sight of his son trembling in fear. He turned to his lawyer. His voice lowered, no longer tense. "I would like to withdraw the petition." A murmur spread across the courtroom. Surprised eyes turned toward him. Even his lawyer froze for a moment, as if needing confirmation of what he had just heard. But Du did not change his mind. There was no longer confrontation in his gaze, only exhaustion and a strange sense of relief, like someone who had just made a decision from the deepest part of his heart. Hoài Ca looked up. She was still kneeling, still holding Tony in her arms. Tears clung to her lashes, but her eyes were filled with disbelief. She looked at Du as if she had misheard him, as if afraid it was only a fleeting statement. Du met her gaze. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. "I want my son to be happy. If being with you is what makes him feel safe, then I have no right to take that away." He paused, his eyes softening as he looked at Tony. "But I am still Tony's father. I don't want to stand outside his life. I want to help care for him, not by fighting, but by doing it together." Those words no longer carried the tone of dispute. It was not a surrender out of defeat, but a concession born from love. Not abandoning responsibility, but choosing a different way to fulfill it. Hung stepped forward. He looked at Du, his eyes no longer guarded like in the days before. He understood that the decision just made had not been easy. He extended his hand, his voice calm. For Tony, a handshake was exchanged. No longer the tight grip of confrontation. No longer the distance of two opposing sides. It was the handshake of grown men willing to set aside pride and place a child's happiness above everything else. The atmosphere gradually softened. Hoài Ca held Tony close. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but this time they were not tears of fear or loss. They were tears of relief, as though a heavy weight pressing down for days had finally been lifted. Tony slowly stopped crying. He still clung to his mother, but his sobs grew quieter, his breathing steadier. In those familiar arms, he found his sense of safety again. The hearing ended not with a cold verdict, but with understanding. No one won. No one lost. Only a child remained where he felt most secure, and the adults learned how to love together, instead of fighting over love. It once seemed that this family would fall apart because of disputes, harsh words, and a courtroom battle so tense it felt suffocating. But in the end, they did not choose to continue fighting. They did not let pride, rights, or the titles of father and mother push everything further into conflict. Instead, they chose to love together rather than compete against one another. After the hearing that day, everything slowly settled. There were no more arguments, no more confrontational glances. What remained was exhaustion mixed with relief, the quiet aftermath of people who had just endured a major storm in their lives. Hoài Ca still held Tony in her arms, but this time her embrace was no longer driven by fear of losing him. It was gratitude that she had been able to keep him close. Hung remained by her side, silent yet steady, like a quiet pillar protecting their small home. And Du left the courtroom with slower steps, but his eyes no longer carried the heavy burden from before. He understood that loving his son did not have to mean possessing him. The agreement that followed was not merely written on paper. It was built on compromise and understanding. Du remained Tony's father. He would continue to care for him, to watch him grow, to be present in his life. Hoài Ca remained the mother who had raised Tony through his earliest years, the safe haven he ran to whenever he was afraid. Hung remained the man willing to protect his wife and child, not bound by blood, but bound by love. From the outside, it might have seemed like everything had ended peacefully. A handshake, a withdrawn petition, a promise to raise a child together. It appeared to be a perfect conclusion to a dispute that once seemed to have no way out. But was that agreement truly strong enough to last? When life returned to its normal rhythm, when emotions calmed, would differences in parenting begin to surface? As Tony grew older and understood more, would he start asking questions that the adults would have to confront? And between Hoài Ca and Du, two people who once stood on opposite sides of a courtroom, would there truly be no invisible distance left between them? The road ahead is never painted in only one peaceful color. Each passing day can bring new challenges. A child growing up surrounded by love from many people is a blessing, but maintaining that delicate balance is a long journey, requiring endless patience and compromise. Hoài Ca would need to learn to open her heart more, so Tony would not feel torn between two worlds. Du would need to prove that withdrawing the petition was not abandoning responsibility, but choosing a different way to love. Hung would continue to act as the bridge, the steady anchor preventing relationships from falling back into tension. And Tony, that sensitive little boy, would remain at the center of it all, the reason the adults must learn to place his happiness above their personal wounds. A home is not a place without storms. A home is the place where, after every storm, people still choose to stay together. The journey to protect that home is far from over. New trials may already be waiting ahead, quiet, but no less difficult. And only by walking forward together will they discover where today's choice will ultimately lead them. Stay tuned for the next episode as we continue to follow Hoài Ca, Hung, Du, and little Tony on their path to preserving their family, where love is tested, and love is also what keeps everyone together.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người nhé. Thì mình vừa mới làm xong video về câu chuyện hôm nay của Hoài Ca và Hùng, cũng như là câu chuyện hôm nay thì có nhắc đến Đô, về việc Đô là bố ruột của Tony, cũng như là việc hai bên tranh chấp về quyền nuôi con trai là Tony. Thì qua câu chuyện thì mọi người cũng có thể thấy được giá trị của câu chuyện hôm nay nó rất sâu sắc và ý nghĩa. Thì trải qua việc Tony đi lạc thì ở trên góc nhìn của một người cha là Đô thì chúng ta cũng có thể thấy được nỗi lo lắng của anh. Và ở bên góc nhìn của Hùng và Hoài Ca thì cũng có thể thấy được cái lo lắng của Hùng và Hoài Ca. Tuy nhiên mỗi người ở một hoàn cảnh khác nhau và rủi ro thì nó luôn có thể xảy ra, cũng như việc Tony đi lạc đó là một điều không ai mong muốn. Và để sự việc đến như thế này thì nói chung là cũng không thể trách ai được. Và cuối cùng họ đã đi đến một cái thống nhất để có thể dành những tình yêu thương tốt nhất đến cho Tony. Vậy diễn biến tiếp theo, những hành trình tiếp theo trong cuộc sống của Hoài Ca và Hùng sẽ như thế nào? Hãy đón xem những tập sau trên kênh của mình nhé. Tạm biệt mọi người.